She had not expected the music to find her the way it did, slipping beneath the noise of the crowded saloon like a current beneath still water, pulling at something deep inside her chest that she had nearly forgotten existed. Marisol Vega stood just inside the swinging doors of the Silver Spur Saloon in Dustcreek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, and she pressed her small leather bag against her ribs as if it were armor. The bag held everything she owned that mattered: a daguerreotype of her mother standing in the courtyard of their home in Guadalajara, a folded letter from the employment agency in San Antonio, and $6.40, which was all that remained after the stagecoach fare and 3 nights at a boarding house that had smelled of cabbage and old smoke. She had not meant to come into the saloon. She had been looking for the millinery shop that the boarding house keeper, a thin-lipped woman named Mrs. Hatch, had pointed her toward when Marisol had asked about work. 2nd Street, past the telegraph office, Mrs. Hatch had said, barely looking up from her ledger. But 2nd Street had proved elusive, and the afternoon sun was brutal, and the sound of a fiddle drifting from the Silver Spur had drawn her in before she had fully made up her mind. The saloon was louder and fuller than she had anticipated for a Thursday afternoon. Men in dusty hats crowded the bar, their boots scraping against the sawdust floor as they shifted and jostled. Card games unfolded at 3 separate tables. A man in a red vest played the upright piano in the corner with more enthusiasm than skill, and beside him the fiddle player, a short, wiry fellow with a magnificent mustache, pulled a lively reel from his instrument that made the floorboards vibrate. And at the tables near the window, the women sat. There were 5 of them, all dressed in gowns that declared their station without ambiguity. They were not saloon girls. They were the respectable women of Dustcreek, gathered for what appeared to be some kind of social occasion, their chairs arranged in a loose circle, their teacups balanced delicately on the table among an assortment of small cakes that someone had clearly brought from home. Marisol recognized the gathering for what it was: a ladies' social, the kind that sprang up in frontier towns where there was not yet a proper meeting hall or a church big enough to hold one comfortably. The saloon keeper, a broad-shouldered man with a neat gray beard, had evidently rented them the better corner of the room for the afternoon. Marisol should have turned around. She understood that. She was not dressed for socializing, and she was certainly not invited, and the way the 5 women turned almost in unison to look at her when she stepped through the door told her that her arrival had been noticed and assessed in approximately the time it took her to draw a single breath. She straightened her spine, as her mother had taught her. Her mother, Esperanza Vega, had been the kind of woman who could walk into any room in any condition and make it feel as though she had always been there. Marisol had inherited that particular talent for composure, if not always her mother's certainty about her own worth. She gave the women a small, polite nod. She was trying to locate the barkeep so she might ask directions to the millinery shop, nothing more. That was when she heard it. The whisper was not especially quiet. Women who whisper in social gatherings rarely intend to be as discreet as they believe themselves to be, and the woman who spoke, a fair-haired lady in a blue gown with extraordinarily starched collar points, clearly wanted at least her nearest neighbor to hear her. "Listen to that," the woman said, though Marisol had not said a word yet. The woman must have caught something, perhaps the soft sound Marisol had made when the door swung back and caught her shoulder, a small involuntary intake of breath followed by a quiet murmur in Spanish that had just slipped out. "Did you hear that? She cannot even speak properly." The neighbor, a dark-haired woman in green, pressed her lips together and tilted her head slightly in that particular gesture that passes for either agreement or polite neutrality depending on the occasion. "She came right in off the street," said another woman, the one seated closest to the window, without lowering her voice appreciably. "You can see she's not from here. Look at her." Marisol heard every word. The fiddle helped, but not enough. She was 22 years old and she had traveled alone from Guadalajara to San Antonio, and then onward to Dustcreek on the strength of a letter offering her employment as a seamstress, only to discover upon arrival that the woman who had written the letter had sold her millinery business and departed Dustcreek 3 weeks prior. $6.40, 3 nights of cabbage smell, and now this. She kept her chin level. She would not give them the satisfaction. She was looking for the barkeep and had located him at the far end of the counter when she became aware of something else entirely. A stillness, or rather a kind of deliberate quieting, in the far left corner of the room. She turned without fully meaning to. He was leaning against the wall near the back of the saloon, far from the piano and the fiddle, far from the card tables and the crowd at the bar. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from real work rather than the illusion of it, and he wore a plain dark hat that was pushed back slightly on his head, as though he had forgotten it was there. His shirt was clean but not fancy, a deep blue chambray that had been laundered many times. He had the look of a man who spent most of his hours outdoors, not because he was rough or unkempt, but because there was a particular kind of easy stillness in him that only comes from long days in open country. He was looking directly at her, not in the way the women had looked at her, measuring and dismissing, not in the way the men at the bar had glanced and then looked away, indifferent. He was looking at her the way you look at something that surprises you, something that arrives unexpectedly and makes you forget for a moment what you were doing before it arrived. He pushed off the wall with a slow, unhurried movement, and Marisol's heart did something complicated. She turned quickly back toward the bar. She was not here for complications. She needed directions to the millinery shop, and then she needed to figure out what in the world she was going to do about her situation, because her situation was, by any reasonable measure, quite serious. "Excuse me," she said to the barkeep. Her voice came out steady and clear, her English careful and precise, shaped by 6 years of study under the Sisters of Charity in Guadalajara who had insisted on proper grammar even when the students would have preferred otherwise. She heard, from the corner with the ladies' social, a brief renewed whisper, and she chose not to hear it. "I am looking for the millinery shop. I was told it is on 2nd Street, past the telegraph office, but I seem to have gone wrong somewhere." The barkeep, whose name she would later learn was Otto, and who was a decent man from Stuttgart who had come west in 1869 and never quite made it back east, set down the glass he was polishing and studied her with the frank, unhurried curiosity of a man who has learned to read people quickly as a professional necessity. "Millinery shop," he said. "That be Mrs. Calloway's place." "Yes," Marisol said, "that is the one." Otto scratched the side of his neck. "Well, the trouble is Mrs. Calloway sold up in February. New owner took it on, fellow named Hargrove, but he turned it into a feed supply. If you're looking for hat work, the nearest millinery now is down in." She closed, Marisol said. She had known this, of course. The boarding house keeper had told her, but hearing it stated plainly by a second person made it settle differently in her chest, heavier and more final. "Afraid so," Otto said, not unkindly. Marisol placed both hands flat on the bar for a moment and breathed. She was not going to despair in a saloon in front of strangers. She was absolutely not going to do that. "Thank you," she said. She was turning to leave when the voice came from just behind her left shoulder, not close enough to startle, but close enough that she knew whoever it belonged to had crossed the room with intention. "I couldn't help but overhear," the voice said. "I apologize for that. Are you looking for work in town?" She turned. It was the man from the wall. Up close he was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark eyes the color of good creek water and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble. There was a small scar above his right eyebrow, faint and old, the kind you stop noticing about a person almost immediately because everything else about their face is more interesting. He held his hat in his hands, which she noted because most men in her experience did not bother to take their hats off when speaking to a woman they did not know, particularly not in a saloon. She said carefully. "I had a letter of employment from Mrs. Calloway, for seamstress work, but it appears the situation has changed." The man nodded slowly, as though this information required actual thought rather than a reflexive response. That's a hard thing to travel a long way for. It is, she said. From the corner with the ladies' social, the fair-haired woman in the blue dress said something to her neighbor that Marisol could not quite make out, but the tone of which was perfectly legible. Marisol kept her eyes on the man in front of her. "My name is Cole Whitfield," he said. He extended his hand. She shook it, which was perhaps not the most conventional response from a woman in 1882, but Marisol had been raised by Esperanza Vega, who shook hands with men she respected and ignored the ones she did not, and convention had never carried as much weight in the Vega household as character. "Marisol Vega," she said. Something moved in his expression when she said her name. Not surprise exactly, but attention, as if her name was a thing worth committing to memory. "Miss Vega," he said, "I don't know what kind of work you're qualified for beyond the seamstress trade, and I don't want to assume, but my sister runs a household 4 miles out, and she has been trying to find someone to help with her mending and some of the cooking since her housekeeper left back in March. It's not what you came here for, but it's honest work and fair pay, and you'd have a room." Marisol studied him. She had been in this country long enough to know that a man offering a young woman a room in an out-of-the-way house could mean many different things, and not all of them decent. She must have shown something of this thought in her expression, because Cole Whitfield looked briefly uncomfortable, not guilty, but embarrassed in a genuine way, the embarrassment of a man who has realized how his words sound and wishes he had arranged them better. "My sister is Sarah Delaney," he said. "She's married to James Delaney. He runs the cattle operation out on Pecan Creek. They have 2 children and a working household. I'd introduce you to her this afternoon if you're willing, and you can make up your mind from there. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now." Marisol looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Otto the barkeep, who had returned to polishing his glasses but was clearly paying attention. "Is this man who he says he is?" she asked Otto. Otto looked up with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Cole Whitfield. Yes, ma'am. His family's had land here 15 years. His sister Sarah's a good woman. The Delaney spread is a proper place." Marisol looked back at Cole Whitfield. "All right," she said. "Thank you." The fiddle player had shifted to a slower tune, something that wound through the saloon like smoke, and the piano had quieted to follow it. It was the kind of music that made people stop what they were doing for a moment and feel something they could not quite name. Cole was watching her with that same attentive quality he'd had from across the room, and she was wondering what exactly he was thinking, when the fair-haired woman in blue rose from her chair in the corner with the particular deliberateness of someone who has made a decision. "Mr. Whitfield," the woman said, raising her voice just enough to carry. Her name, Marisol would learn, was Mrs. Doris Finch, wife of the town's land assessor, a woman who had appointed herself the arbiter of social standards in Dustcreek with considerable enthusiasm. "I'm surprised to see you keeping such close company with a stranger in a public place, particularly given," and here she paused in a way that was clearly intended to communicate volumes, "the circumstances." Cole turned to look at Mrs. Finch with an expression of perfect, pleasant blankness. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Finch," he said. "I only mean to say," Mrs. Finch pressed on, adjusting the front of her blue gown, "that there are proper channels for these things. An employment agency, for instance. Or the Ladies' Aid." "I appreciate your concern," Cole said, in a tone that communicated no appreciation whatsoever. He turned back to Marisol. "My horse is outside. I can get you to the Delaney place before supper if we head out now, but there's no rush. The offer stands whenever you're ready." Marisol noticed that Mrs. Finch was looking at her with an expression compounded of curiosity, disapproval, and something that might have been, in a different person, fascination. She noticed the other women watching too, their teacups lowered. She decided then that she liked Cole Whitfield. She did not yet know if she could trust him fully, and she was too careful a person to leap to conclusions about a man she had met 7 minutes ago in a saloon, but she liked him. He had not told Mrs. Finch to mind her business because there was no need to. His tone had done it for him. And he had not been embarrassed by being seen talking to her, which was more than she could say for several men she had encountered since crossing into Texas. "There is something I would like to do first," she said. She walked to the far end of the bar, past the nearest card table, to where the fiddle player had set down his instrument for a moment to wipe his hands on his kerchief. "Do you take requests?" she asked him. The fiddle player looked at her with pleasant surprise. "Depends on the tune, ma'am. Do you know La Paloma?" He thought about it, then nodded slowly. "I know the melody. Can't promise the words." "The melody is enough," Marisol said. She came back to where Cole was standing at the bar. The fiddle player picked up his instrument again and after a moment of quiet tuning drew the bow across the strings, and the opening notes of La Paloma floated out into the saloon, liquid and unhurried, old and beautiful. From the corner, Marisol heard one of the women say in a carrying whisper, "What on earth is she doing?" And then she heard another voice, lower and uncertain, say, "I think she requested that." And then the music was too beautiful to think much about anything else. Cole Whitfield stood beside her and listened too, his hat still in his hands, and after a moment he said quietly so only she could hear, "That's a beautiful song." "My mother sang it," Marisol said, "when she wanted to remember that the world was larger than whatever problem was in front of her." He looked at her sidelong carefully. "Is that what you're doing right now?" "I am trying to," she said. They stood there for a little while longer, the two of them, while the fiddle played and the afternoon light came through the saloon's windows in long, golden bars, and the women in the corner whispered, and the men at the bar talked, and none of it touched them very much. Then Cole said, "Ready when you are," and she nodded, and they went out into the sun together. His horse was a bay gelding, solid and patient, tied to the hitching post in front of the saloon with the easy confidence of an animal that has stood in many such places, and expected nothing dramatic. Cole's manner with the horse was matter-of-fact and gentle in the way that revealed a person's actual character better than almost anything else Marisol had ever found. "You're comfortable riding?" he asked. He had a second horse, a smaller gray mare, tied beside the bay. He had clearly come to town with some intention of bringing someone back with him, which made her pause for a moment. "You brought 2 horses," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I came to town today because Sarah sent me to find someone to help her. The employment agency in town told me they had no one available, but one of the freighters mentioned that a woman from out of state had come looking for Mrs. Calloway's old shop. I figured whoever it was might find themselves in a difficult spot and might need a horse to ride." She absorbed this. "You were looking for me, or someone like me." "Someone in a difficult spot who might need work," he said. "That's all I knew. Whether it turned out to be you or someone else wasn't something I could predict." A pause. "I'm glad it was you," he added, and then seemed briefly surprised by having said it, and looked away at some point above the rooftops. Marisol hid what might have been a smile, and mounted the gray mare with the competence of a woman who had grown up in a household where horsemanship was simply expected. The ride out to the Delaney Ranch was 4 miles of Texas landscape in the full glory of late April, which meant the bluebonnets were still holding along the creek banks, and the air had that particular quality of warmth that is not yet summer but is clearly practicing. The road was unpaved and occasionally enthusiastic in terms of its irregularities, and they rode mostly in silence for the first mile, which was a comfortable silence of the kind that requires actually comfortable people to produce. "How long did you travel?" Cole asked eventually. 14 days from Guadalajara," she said. "The stagecoach from San Antonio took 2 more. He absorbed this. "You came a long way on the word of a letter." "The letter came from an employment agency that had been in business for 12 years, she said. "I had no reason to doubt it, and I had reason to go." She paused, deciding how much to say to a man she had known for less than half an hour. Then she said, "My mother died in November. There was nothing to keep me in Guadalajara and something that felt like a reason to go." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you," she said. It was a small phrase and she said it simply, and he did not try to expand on his condolences the way people sometimes did, filling the space with words when silence was the more honest response. She appreciated that. What was her name? He asked. No one in Texas had asked her that. Esperanza, she said. It means hope. Did she? He asked. Hope, I mean. Marisol looked out at the bluebonnets along the creek bank and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, the way a knot loosens when you find the right strand to pull. Enormously, she said, until the end. They reached the Delaney ranch as the sun was beginning to angle toward the west. It was a proper working ranch, not a grand establishment but a solid one, with a substantial house of limestone and cedar, a large barn in good repair, a bunkhouse where a handful of ranch hands were finishing the day's work, and a kitchen garden that someone had planted with evident care along the south side of the house. Sarah Delaney came out to meet them before they had finished tying the horses. She was 30 years old, small and quick in her movements, with the same dark eyes as her brother but a more immediately open expression. She was carrying a child on her hip, a boy of about 2 who regarded Marisol with the solemn, unblinking assessment of a small person who has not yet learned that staring is considered impolite. "You found someone," Sarah said to Cole, and there was relief in her voice so genuine that Marisol felt the last of her wariness begin to dissolve. "This is Marisol Vega," Cole said. "She came from Guadalajara for the Callaway job. I explained the situation and she was willing to come out and meet you." Sarah transferred the child to her other hip and extended her free hand. "I am so glad you came. I've been running this household with 2 small children and no help since March, and I will tell you honestly, at the very end of my rope." She glanced at her brother with a look that communicated an entire history. Did Cole explain the arrangement? "A room and meals and fair wages for sewing and cooking help," Marisol said. $3 a week, Sarah said. "The room is small, but it's private and it has its own window. You would not be asked to do more than is reasonable, and you would have Sundays free." She looked at Marisol with the straightforward directness of a woman who had been practical out of necessity for long enough that it had become her natural mode. "Can you cook?" "Yes," Marisol said. "I can cook very well." Sarah smiled, and it transformed her face entirely. "Then you are hired if you want to be." Marisol looked at the house with its limestone walls and its kitchen garden, at the patient horses and the sound of cattle somewhere beyond the ridge, at Sarah Delaney who needed help and did not pretend otherwise, and at Cole Whitfield who was standing a little apart with his hat back in his hands, looking at her with an expression she could not yet fully read but which did not alarm her. "Yes," she said, "I want to be." She had been at the Delaney ranch for 2 weeks when she began to understand that Dustcreek was a town that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. It had been established properly in 1874, which made it 8 years old and no longer a raw settlement but not quite a settled community either. It had a school, a church, 2 saloons, a general store, a doctor, a bank, and the beginnings of a newspaper. All the apparatus of civilization overlaid on a landscape that had its own ancient, complicated history and its own ancient, complicated tensions. The Comanche had been pushed off this land within living memory, and the Mexican families who had held ranches here before Texas had found themselves in various states of dispossession and displacement after 1836, a history that the current residents of Dustcreek acknowledged with varying degrees of honesty. Marisol was aware of this history in the way that someone carries knowledge in their bones rather than their conscious thoughts. She was the daughter of a woman whose own grandmother had told stories of what this land had been before the lines on the maps had been redrawn. She was also, by temperament, a person who preferred to understand her circumstances clearly rather than to pretend they were simpler than they were. She settled into the Delaney household with the efficient grace of someone who had been managing a complex domestic situation since she was 14. Her cooking proved to be exactly as good as she had claimed, better, in fact, and Sarah Delaney's table transformed from something adequate into something remarkable within the first week. The mending and sewing accumulated in a basket in the corner of the sitting room was dispatched with similar competence. The two Delaney children, Henry, who was 4, and Thomas, who was 2, were won over with a combination of patience and the remarkable skill of making animals from scraps of fabric that Marisol had learned from her mother. What she had not anticipated was Cole. He came to supper most evenings. He did not live at the Delaney ranch. His own place was 3 miles farther along Pecan Creek, a smaller operation where he ran cattle and horses and managed well enough as a bachelor. But he had fallen into the habit of riding over most evenings, and it was a habit that predated her arrival by years. She understood this. He was close to his sister, and James Delaney was a good man but a quiet one who worked long days and was not much for conversation after them. So Cole's visits served a social function for the household that everyone valued. She understood this perfectly well. What she could not quite manage was to be indifferent to the fact that when he arrived in the evenings, he would come first to wherever she was working and ask, in that quiet, attentive way he had, how her day had been, not as a pleasantry. He actually wanted to know. The third evening she had been in the kitchen making tortillas, a task she undertook with the focused, practiced efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times and found in the repetitive motion a kind of peace. Cole had come in to wash his hands at the basin, as he always did before supper, and had stopped when he saw what she was making. "I haven't had tortillas since I was a boy," he said. She looked at him with some surprise. "You have had them before." "The family that had the land before ours, before my father bought it in '67, they were Mexican. The Salazar family. They stayed on for a few years to help with the transition. My father insisted on fair pay and fair dealing, and Mrs. Salazar taught my mother to cook several things." He paused. "They left in '71. I never knew exactly why, though I suspected it had to do with the way the town was treating them by then." Marisol looked at the tortilla in her hands and then at him. "Your father sounds like a decent man." "He tried to be," Cole said. He watched her work for a moment with that same quality of genuine attention. "Can I help with anything?" She almost laughed, because men in 1882 Texas did not, as a general rule, offer to help with kitchen work. But she caught it and simply said, "You can stir that pot. It needs to be watched." He stirred the pot carefully and without complaint, and they talked while they worked, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and also, she recognized, potentially the beginning of something considerably less simple. By the fourth week she was trying to be sensible about it, which was made more difficult by the fact that he was genuinely interesting. He had read widely, which surprised her until he explained that his mother had been a school teacher from Virginia who had brought a considerable library west, and had insisted that her children use it. He had opinions about things that he expressed carefully and modified willingly when presented with a better argument. He was curious about her life in Guadalajara, about her mother, about the Sisters of Charity and what they had taught her, about the cathedral in Guadalajara that she described once with enough precision that he said, quietly, "I'd like to see that someday." She said, "Perhaps you will," and meant it as a general pleasantry, but the way he looked at her when she said it suggested he was filing it under something more specific. The complications she had anticipated came not from Cole but from the town. Dustcreek's social world was small and therefore dense with attention. The ladies of the town, including and especially Mrs. Doris Finch, who had appointed herself its moral weather vane, had noted Marisol's arrival, her accent, her dark hair, her position at the Delaney ranch, and her evident comfort in Cole Whitfield's company, and had formed views about all of these things that they were not shy about expressing. She heard about it first from Sarah, who told her directly and apologetically one morning while they were working in the kitchen garden. "Mrs. Finch has been telling people that my brother is making a fool of himself," Sarah said, pulling weeds with somewhat more force than the weeds strictly required. She said some things at the church social that I was told about by 3 different people who seemed to think I should know. What sort of things? Marisol asked. She kept her voice level. She was planting seedlings and she was not going to lose her composure over Mrs. Doris Finch. Sarah looked uncomfortable. The kind of things that are more about where you come from than anything you've actually done. She told Mrs. Hargrove that your accent alone should have put Cole off. That a man of his standing ought to know better. Sarah pressed her lips together. I told James, and James said Mrs. Finch ought to occupy herself with her own household and leave other people's alone, and I said I couldn't have put it better myself. Marisol pressed a seedling into the dark earth with careful hands. She is not wrong that there are people who would think less of your brother for spending time with me, she said. That is simply the truth of it. It's a stupid truth, Sarah said flatly. Most of the ones that cause the most trouble are, Marisol agreed. She had been in Dustcreek for 6 weeks when Cole rode into the ranch yard on a Saturday morning not during his usual evening hour, and asked if she might like to ride out to the creek with him. He said it with the careful tone of a man who has practiced a sentence several times and is still not entirely sure of it. She looked at him from the porch where she was sitting with a shirt of James's she was mending, and she thought about sensibility and practicality, and the $6.40 that had long since become irrelevant since she was earning her own wage now. She thought about Esperanza Vega and what Esperanza would have said, which was probably something along the lines of, a woman who is afraid to want something will spend her whole life pretending not to want things, and that is not a life, Mija, that is just waiting. Let me put this down, she said, and went inside to leave the shirt on the sitting room table. They rode along Pecan Creek for an hour through the long Texas spring morning, the water running clear and quick over the limestone bed, the cottonwoods along the bank throwing lacy shadows. Cole showed her a bend in the creek where a pair of herons had built a nest, and she told him about the river birds of Jalisco, and at some point they stopped riding and let the horses drink and stood on the bank with the water talking over the stones, and Cole said, without looking at her, I'd like to come courting if you're agreeable to it. She looked at the creek for a moment. Have you been courting anyone else? She asked. It was a direct question, but she felt she had a right to it. No, he said. There was a young woman a few years back, but that ended before it began, really. There's been no one since. He paused. I'm not impulsive. I've known you 6 weeks and I know that's not long, but I don't think I need significantly more time to know that I want the chance to know you better. He turned to look at her then, and his expression was entirely unguarded for the first time she could recall. The practical, steady manner stripped away to something more direct and more honest. I want to be clear with you. I'm not asking for anything improper. I'm asking to court you properly, with your consent in the open. In the open, she said, even with what people are saying. Especially because of it, he said. I'm not ashamed of anything and I won't behave as though I should be. She looked at this man, this 26-year-old Texas rancher who had crossed a saloon to talk to her when other men had looked away, who stirred pots in his sister's kitchen without embarrassment, who spoke of the Salazar family with something close to grief for what had been lost. She thought about the creek running over limestone and her mother singing La Paloma in a courtyard in Guadalajara. She thought about the long way she had come. Yes, she said. I am agreeable. What followed was the finest season of her life since her mother's illness had shadowed the preceding ones. Cole was a methodical and sincere person when it came to his intentions. He did not make grand gestures. He brought her small things. A book of poetry he thought she might like, found in the general store, its spine slightly battered. A branch of wildflowers cut near the creek. Once, a small carved figure of a horse that a passing artisan had been selling from a wagon, which he presented with what she now recognized as his characteristic mixture of directness and slight embarrassment about his own sentiment. They rode together on Saturday mornings when her work was done. They read to each other in the evening sometimes, at the Delaney kitchen table, Sarah and James nearby, which was proper and also genuinely enjoyable. Cole was articulate when he was thinking and quiet when he was not thinking, and she found both of these states entirely comfortable to be near. He asked her questions about her life in Mexico, with the genuine interest of a person who wants to understand rather than simply to gather information. She told him about the courtyard of their house in Guadalajara, which had a pomegranate tree and a fountain that made a sound like a conversation between people who had known each other a very long time. She told him about her mother's illness, about the way it had progressed through the last year of Esperanza's life, slow and then very fast, and about how Marisol had sat by her bed in the last weeks reading to her from the same book of poetry that Esperanza had read to her as a child. Cole listened to all of it with his full attention, and once, when she told him about the last morning of her mother's life, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his without saying anything, and she thought it was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had done for her since Esperanza died. She told Sarah, in the frank and comfortable way they had developed, that she was falling in love with her brother, and Sarah said, without looking up from her darning, "I know. I've been watching it happen for 2 months and trying not to say anything because it wasn't my business to hurry it." "Was it obvious?" Marisol asked. "To me," Sarah said. James noticed too, and James notices almost nothing. Cole walks in the door and the first thing he does is look for you. If you're not in the room, he looks toward whatever room you might be in. I think he does it without knowing he does it. Marisol thought about this for a long time after, in the small private way of someone turning a pleasant thing over in their mind to look at it from different angles. What changed the pace of everything was Mrs. Finch's campaign, which had been simmering since Marisol's arrival and reached something close to a boil in July. She did not fully understand what had precipitated it. Later, she pieced together that Mrs. Finch had been told by someone, possibly Mrs. Hargrove, who seemed to maintain a keen interest in the Whitfield family's social life, that Cole had been seen in the jewelry display case at the general store, looking at rings. This intelligence had apparently moved Mrs. Finch to action in a way that simple disapproval had not. Marisol was in town with Sarah on a July Tuesday to collect supplies and mail when she came out of the post office to find Mrs. Finch standing on the boardwalk with 2 of her usual companions, positioned with the unmistakable deliberateness of people who have arranged themselves to be encountered. "Miss Vega," Mrs. Finch said. She had a voice like a letterpress, firm and mechanical. "I wonder if I might have a word." Sarah, who was 2 steps behind Marisol, made a sound that was not quite a word. "Of course," Marisol said. Mrs. Finch drew herself up. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with the kind of iron self-confidence that comes not from genuine security, but from years of having been the largest social force in a small room. "I'll come directly to the point, as I think directness is the Christian virtue," she said. "There is talk in this town about you and Cole Whitfield. Now, I have nothing personally against you, but the fact is that a match between a man of Cole's standing in this community and a woman of your," she paused in her signature fashion, "background, would cause considerable comment." Marisol looked at her calmly. She was aware of Sarah beside her, vibrating with contained fury. She was also aware of several people on the boardwalk who had arranged their attention on this exchange with great interest. "I appreciate you speaking to me directly," Marisol said. "I would like to do the same. My background includes a family that has lived on this continent far longer than yours. I was educated by the Sisters of Charity and have spoken 3 languages since I was 15. I'm a hard worker and an honest person, and I love Cole Whitfield, who is one of the finest men I have ever met." She paused for exactly as long as Mrs. Finch usually paused. "If the town of Dustcreek has a problem with any of those facts, I am sorry for the town, but it will not change my conduct or my intentions." The boardwalk was very quiet for a moment. Mrs. Finch's expression went through several stages that Marisol watched with interest. Surprise was first, then something harder, then something more complicated that she could not entirely read. "Well," Mrs. Finch said finally, "I see. "I think you do," Marisol said pleasantly. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Finch." She walked away with Sarah, and it was not until they had turned the corner onto the side street that Sarah grabbed her arm and said in a voice somewhere between a laugh and pure admiration, "That was the finest thing I have ever seen in my life." "I was shaking the entire time," Marisol admitted. "You didn't show it for one single second," Sarah said. Marisol bought a length of blue ribbon at the general store and decided that she felt considerably better than she had an hour before. She told Cole about the encounter that evening. She had thought about not telling him, about handling it as her own matter, but she had also spent enough time with him now to know that he would want to know, not so he could intervene, but because they had developed the habit of honesty with each other that neither of them wanted to disrupt. He listened without interrupting, his elbows on the kitchen table, his coffee getting cold beside him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She had no right to say those things to you," he said. "No," Marisol agreed, "but I handled it." "I know you did." He looked at her with that direct, unhurried regard. "I want to be angry on your behalf." "You can be," she said. "But it won't undo it, and I'd rather talk about something else." He almost smiled. "What would you rather talk about?" "The book we were reading last week," she said. "You said you had a theory about the last chapter." He shook his head slowly in a way that was not disagreement but more like amazed appreciation, and reached for the book on the shelf behind him, and they sat in the lamplight of Sarah's kitchen, and talked about the chapter and then several other things, and it was exactly the right evening after exactly the wrong afternoon. Cole proposed to her on a Thursday in August. It was not the Saturday she might have expected, or an evening at the ranch, or any particularly arranged occasion. It was a Thursday morning because he had ridden over for a reason he had probably not entirely planned, and had found her alone in the kitchen garden while Sarah had taken the children to visit a neighbor. He stood on the other side of the garden gate with his hat in his hands, again, which she had come to think of as his characteristic posture when something important was pressing on him. She straightened up from the tomato plants and looked at him. He had a small box in one hand. He held it out in the way of a man who has rehearsed a speech and then abandoned it as insufficient. "I love you," he said. "I've known it for a while, and I've been trying to find the right way to say everything else that goes with it, and I think the trouble is that there isn't a right way. There's only the true way, so I'm going to say that. I want to spend my life with you. I want to know everything about your life in Guadalajara, and hear you speak Spanish when you're happy and help you make a home here that feels as much like yours as mine. I want to build something with you." He opened the box. The ring inside was not extravagant, but it was beautiful. A slender gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, the color of the creek on a clear day. "If you'll have me." Marisol looked at the ring and then at him and felt her heart do the complicated thing it had been doing since the first afternoon in the Silver Spur saloon, only larger now, more certain of itself. "Cole," she said. "Yes." "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to be sensible about it for months." "How did that go?" he asked, and she could hear that he was holding something in, something warm and a little undone. "Badly," she said. He smiled then, fully and without reserve, and it was the first time she had seen him smile that way, and it made him look younger and more open than his usual expression, and she thought that she wanted to be the reason for that smile for the rest of her life. She came out of the garden and he put the ring on her finger, and then she stepped forward, and he folded her into an embrace that was complete and unhurried, and the garden smelled of tomatoes and warm earth, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was going through its entire considerable repertoire. The next few weeks were a particular kind of lively. Sarah was so genuinely delighted that she cried, which surprised James into patting her somewhat awkwardly on the shoulder, which was the most demonstrative she had ever seen him. Henry, the 4-year-old, was told about the engagement and absorbed it with the philosophical calm of a child who does not yet understand what an engagement is. Thomas, the 2-year-old, sat on Marisol's lap and played with the ribbon from her hair and was satisfied. Cole's parents, William and Helen Whitfield, came from their farm 30 miles east of Dustcreek when they heard the news. Marisol had been somewhat anxious about this visit in a way she had not allowed herself to show. William Whitfield was a large, deliberate man who looked very much like his son, which gave her an advanced picture of what Cole might look like in 30 years, and she found the picture entirely agreeable. Helen Whitfield was a small woman from Virginia who had been a schoolteacher and whose library had traveled west in a wagon, and who looked at Marisol with a keen, warm attention that was academic and emotional simultaneously. It was Helen who said on the second evening of their visit, when Cole and his father had gone out to look at the horses, "Cole told me you speak 3 languages." "For now, a little," Marisol said. "I have been working on my German." "Otto at the Silver Spur has been helpful." Helen Whitfield made a sound that was pure delight. "I have been telling this boy for years to find someone interesting," she said. "I am so glad he finally listened." They set the wedding for October, which was Sarah's suggestion on the practical grounds that the worst of the summer heat would be past, the fall cattle drive would be done, and the wildflowers along Pecan Creek, though different from the spring varieties, were still considerable in early October. Cole said he would marry Marisol in January in a blizzard if she wanted, and she said she preferred October, and October was decided. The wedding was held on a Saturday morning at the Dustcreek church, which was small and whitewashed, and had a bell that one of the Delaney Ranch hands rang with evident enthusiasm. Sarah was Marisol's attendant, in her best green dress that brought out her dark eyes. James stood with Cole. Helen Whitfield sat in the front pew and wept decorously throughout the ceremony, and William sat beside her and handed her a handkerchief from his breast pocket at regular intervals, with the practiced ease of a man who has been doing this for 31 years. The Reverend performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity. Cole held both of her hands and said his vows with the same quality he brought to every important thing, slowly, precisely, meaning every word. When Marisol said hers, she said them in both English and Spanish, which had not been discussed in advance but which felt exactly right, and she heard from somewhere behind her a sound that might have been the beginning of a sob, which she later learned had come from Mrs. Hargrove, who had apparently been moved unexpectedly. Mrs. Finch was in attendance. She had come, Marisol suspected, out of the complicated social arithmetic that says it is more costly to refuse certain invitations than to attend them. She sat toward the back and said nothing, and when Marisol and Cole walked back up the aisle after the ceremony, their hands clasped, Marisol looked at Mrs. Finch directly and gave her the same small, polite nod she had given her that first afternoon in the Silver Spur. Mrs. Finch, after a moment, nodded back. It was not reconciliation exactly, but it was something. After the church, there was a celebration at the Delaney Ranch, which had been set up in the yard with tables brought from several neighbors and food that represented a genuine communal effort. Marisol had cooked for 2 days. Helen Whitfield had brought things from her kitchen 30 miles away. Sarah had organized everything else with the military efficiency of a woman who had been running a frontier household for 5 years. There was music, naturally. The fiddle player from the Silver Spur, whose name turned out to be Mr. Aldo Marsh, and who was a better man than his saloon appearances suggested, had been engaged to play, along with 2 other musicians who between them covered guitar and a battered but serviceable accordion. And when Mr. Marsh began to play, and Cole turned to her and extended his hand in the particular way of a man asking for a dance, it struck her that this was an echo of something, a version of a moment that had almost happened the first afternoon in the Silver Spur, when she had stood at the bar and the music had played and she had not yet known who he was. She took his hand. They danced on the packed earth of the ranch yard in the October afternoon, with the smell of cedar smoke and roasting meat and the late wildflowers along the creek. Cole was a competent dancer, not a showy one, which was consistent with everything else about him. She was a good dancer because Esperanza had made sure of it, and together they were quite good, easy and well-matched in the way of people who are also easy and well-matched in other respects. She heard from somewhere nearby a familiar opening melody begin to thread through the air. La Paloma. Mr. Marsh had remembered. She felt her eyes fill and blinked it back, almost succeeding. Cole saw it anyway because he always saw things and leaned in close to say, very quietly, "Your mother would have liked this, I think." She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. "She would have loved you," she said. "She had a very good eye." "I know," he said, "because she raised you." They danced all the way through La Paloma, and it was the most beautiful dance of her life, in the October sun of Texas with her new husband's arms around her, and the memory of her mother's voice in the melody, and the cottonwoods along Pecan Creek going gold. The first year of their marriage was a thing of quiet daily richness that Marisol had not fully known to expect. She had expected to be happy, or at least hoped so. She had not expected the particular texture of happiness that came from building a life with someone whose company was genuinely good, and whose character proved, upon the close inspection that marriage enables, to be even more solid than it had appeared at a distance. She moved into Cole's house on Pecan Creek, which needed work that she saw immediately and approached without complaint, going at it with the same competent energy she brought to everything. The house was a good-bones house, well-built but bachelor-plain, and she began to make it into a home with a patience and a sense of intention that Cole watched with something between admiration and the practical willingness to help with whatever she needed. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring that was twice the size of the one at the Delaney Ranch. She brought seeds that she had ordered through the general store, and one morning she planted a pomegranate tree, which was ambitious this far north but which she intended to give every possible advantage. Cole helped her dig the hole without asking any questions about why she wanted a pomegranate tree in central Texas, which she considered one of his finer qualities. "My mother's courtyard had one," she told him afterward, when they were washing the dirt from their hands at the pump. "I want to see if this one will grow here." He looked at the small tree, barely a sapling, optimistic in its newness. "It might take a few years to establish," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not in a hurry." He caught her hand as she dried it, still looking at the small tree, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they looked at it together for a moment, this hopeful small thing in the Texas ground. She continued her connection to the town even as she built her life outside it. She went to church on Sundays with Cole, and she brought food to the social events because her food was remarkable enough that even people who were ambivalent about her presence found themselves grateful for it. She helped Sarah with the children and came into town for supplies and began, gradually, to develop actual friendships with several of the women in Dustcreek who were not Mrs. Finch's particular type. There was Lucinda Torres, whose family had been in Texas since before Texas was Texas, and who recognized in Marisol a kindred spirit with some relief and considerable warmth. Lucinda was 30, dark-haired and vivid, married to a silversmith, and she and Marisol developed a friendship that was fast and solid, the kind that sometimes forms between people who see each other clearly right away. There was also Agnes Park, the doctor's wife, an Ohio woman who had come west without prejudice because she had enough practical problems to solve without manufacturing social ones. Agnes was forthright and funny and taught Marisol to play checkers, which Marisol became alarmingly good at almost immediately. And there was, eventually and unexpectedly, something approaching a thaw with Mrs. Finch herself, which came about through the agency of Mrs. Finch's youngest daughter, Beatrice, who was 17 and had what her mother described as a desperate want to learn French, which Marisol could teach, being one of her 4 languages. The arrangement was proposed by Mrs. Finch, with the careful dignity of a woman offering a truce without fully acknowledging that there has been a war. She came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of Cole and Marisol's first married year, and Marisol served her tea on the porch and they negotiated in the polite, a bleak way of women who understand each other perfectly without quite saying so, and Beatrice began her French lessons the following week. Beatrice was a delightful student, quick and earnest, with none of her mother's armor. She sat at Marisol's kitchen table twice a week, and worked her way through French with the same determined concentration she apparently brought to all her learning. And by autumn, she was reading simple texts and writing short compositions, and clearly adored Marisol in the direct, uncomplicated way of young people who admire someone and have not yet learned to suppress it. Mrs. Finch, witnessing this, said nothing publicly, but she stopped whispering about accents. By October of their first year, Marisol knew she was expecting a child. She told Cole on a Sunday evening after supper, in their kitchen with the lamp burning and the smell of the day's bread still in the room. She said it simply, watching his face. His face did the thing she had hoped for, which was to become entirely and undefendedly full of feeling. He crossed the kitchen and held her in both arms and pressed his lips to her hair and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right? Are you feeling well?" "I feel completely fine," she said. "Your mother says this is a very good sign." He pulled back to look at her. "You told my mother first." "She asked me a direct question this afternoon, and I don't lie to people who ask me direct questions," Marisol said. "She's been watching me with that medical eye of hers since June." Cole laughed, which was one of her favorite sounds. "She taught school for 20 years. She notices things. She also told me that she had an easy time with both her pregnancies and that her mother did too, and that she hopes the same will be true for me," Marisol said. "Then she cried a little. Then she pulled herself together and started telling me things I ought to eat." "That sounds exactly like her," Cole said. Marisol leaned her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat for a moment. "Cole." "Yes." "I want to send for Esperanza's sister," she said. "My Aunt Catalina. She is all the family I have left, and she is alone in Guadalajara, and I want her here." She paused. "I have been thinking about it for a while. I don't know if she will come, but I want to ask." Cole was quiet for a moment, the quietness of actual thought. "Write her this week," he said. "We'll send the fare." "It's a significant sum," she said. "I know," he said. "Write to her anyway." She wrote the letter the next day in her best Spanish, which was also simply her Spanish since she did not have a second best. She sent it with the week's mail, and then waited with the patience she had learned from her mother, who said that patience was not the absence of feeling but the presence of trust. The wait was 3 months, which was what the mail took. Catalina's response was a letter of 3 pages, written in the Baroque and affectionate style of a woman who loved her pen, and had a great deal to say. The answer was yes. Catalina Vega arrived in Dustcreek on a spring afternoon in 1884, by stagecoach, with 3 large trunks and a small cage containing 2 birds that had survived the journey by means that were not entirely clear, and whose presence caused the stagecoach driver considerable commentary that Catalina ignored with absolute serenity. She was 55 years old, broad and warm and formidable, with Esperanza's eyes and her own particular brand of authority, and she stepped out of the stage and looked at Dustcreek, Texas, with the expression of a woman assessing a new landscape and finding it interesting if not entirely satisfactory. Then she saw Marisol, who was standing in the street with Cole beside her, and Catalina opened her arms, and the reunion happened in the middle of the main street of Dustcreek, in full view of anyone who cared to watch, which was most of the town. Cole shook Catalina's hand, and then found himself embraced with significant force, which he bore with good grace. Catalina looked at him at arm's length afterward with Esperanza's same keen, warm eyes and said, in Spanish, "She wrote very well of you. Better than that, she wrote honestly of you, which tells me more." Then she switched to careful but definite English. "I think you are a good man. I will find out if I am right." Cole, who had now been assessed by a Vega woman twice in his life and found the experience both terrifying and clarifying, said, "I hope to give you no reason to change your mind." Catalina laughed and said something in Spanish to Marisol that made Marisol put her hand over her mouth to contain her amusement, and Cole decided he would ask for the translation later. The baby arrived in June of 1884, a boy, born at the house on Pecan Creek with Agnes Parks' husband the doctor in attendance and Catalina managing everything else with the calm authority of a woman who has seen births in 3 countries and considers the process entirely manageable if everyone cooperates. Sarah was there. Helen Whitfield was there. Cole was there, which was not the universal custom of the time but which was not in question where Cole was concerned, because he had said he intended to be present, and Marisol had said she would be glad of it, and that was that. They named him Mateo William Whitfield. The William was for Cole's father, who turned a remarkable shade of red when he was told. Mateo was a round, emphatic child who from his first days had his father's dark eyes and his mother's expression of alert, intelligent assessment of his surroundings. He was adored by Henry and Thomas Delaney, who were now 6 and 4, and treated their new cousin as a profound personal windfall. He was also adored by Catalina, who had settled into a room at the ranch house with the birds and her trunks and her considerable personality, and who brought to the household a density of warmth and sound in cooking that transformed it once again. Marisol recovered well, as Helen had hoped she might, and was back in her garden within 3 weeks, though Cole stayed near and watched her with the attentive anxiety of a man who cannot stop worrying even when there is nothing left to worry about. "I am fine," she told him, on a morning when he had followed her to the garden for the 3rd time that day on various transparent pretexts. "I know you are," he said. "Then why are you following me around?" "Force of habit," he said, and she laughed, and the sound of it pleased him so visibly that she went and stood beside him and let him put his arm around her while they both looked at the kitchen garden and the small pomegranate tree, which had survived its 2nd winter and was showing signs of genuine confidence. "It might actually grow," she said. "I never doubted it," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. In the house behind them, Catalina was singing something in the kitchen, and Mateo was making the sounds of a well-fed and thoroughly contented person, and the creek was talking over the stones, and the mockingbird was back in the cottonwood. It was in the autumn of that year that Mrs. Finch came to call properly, with a tin of biscuits and no obvious agenda, which was itself an agenda of a kind. She sat on the porch and held Mateo with the practiced ease of a woman who had held many babies, and admired his eyes and his grip and his general vigorous disposition, and said nothing that was unkind or pointed. As she was leaving she said, without quite looking at Marisol, "Beatrice has been offered a teaching position in Austin. She credits her French lessons as making her more qualified. She worked very hard," Marisol said. "She's a gifted student." Mrs. Finch was quiet for a moment, looking at the pomegranate tree. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. The words came out with the careful deliberateness of something that has been considered at length. "For some things I said when you first arrived, and for some things I allowed to be said in my company without correcting them." Marisol looked at her steadily. The woman before her was not a villain. She was simply someone who had confused the preservation of her particular world with the preservation of something actually worth protecting. The distinction was important. "I appreciate that," Marisol said. "I imagine I sounded very certain of things I had no right to be certain about," Mrs. Finch said. "You did," Marisol agreed. "But here we both are." Mrs. Finch looked up and met her eyes for a moment, and something passed between them that was not quite friendship, but was considerably more than what had existed before. Then she straightened her collar in her characteristic way and said, "That little tree of yours is going to surprise everyone." "That is my intention," Marisol said. Cole had watched this exchange from the barn doorway with the careful, invisible attention he was capable of when he thought no one was watching. When Mrs. Finch's buggy had gone down the road and Marisol came back into the yard, he came out of the barn and she looked at him and shook her head slowly. "How much did you hear?" she asked. "Some of it," he admitted. "The important parts, I think." He came to her and touched her face, his thumb along her cheek in the gentle, certain way he had developed, the way of a man who has stopped being careful about showing what he feels because the person he feels it for has never given him reason to be careful. "Are you all right?" "Better than all right," she said. She turned her face slightly into his hand. "I was just thinking that this is not what I came here for, and it is much better than what I came here for." "What did you come here for?" he asked. "A seamstress position," she reminded him. He smiled. "And what did you get?" She looked at the house and the garden and the pomegranate tree and the creek beyond, heard Catalina singing and Mateo's sounds of satisfaction, and somewhere beyond that the particular quality of a Texas afternoon that she had come to love because it was also his. "Everything," she said. He kissed her there in the ranch yard in the full light of the October afternoon, which was not particularly conventional behavior for 1884, and which neither of them gave any thought to whatsoever. Their second child came in 1886, a girl this time, born in March when the bluebonnets were just beginning along the creek. They named her Elena Esperanza Whitfield. The Esperanza was for the woman who had raised a daughter brave enough to cross a continent alone, and the hope she had carried until the end. Elena was smaller than Mateo had been and quieter, with her mother's dark hair and her father's quality of watchful attention. She looked at the world from her first days with a calm, measuring regard that made Cole say, the first time he saw it, "She already knows something we don't." Mateo received his sister with the proprietary affection of a 2-year-old who has not yet learned jealousy, and finds a new person in the household simply an improvement. He sat beside Marisol whenever she was nursing Elena and patted various things gently and narrated the process in a mix of English and Spanish that made perfect sense to him and was genuinely difficult to follow for anyone else. Catalina was in her element. She had established herself in Dustcreek with the same thorough intention Marisol had shown, and by the time Elena was born had accumulated a social circle of her own that included Lucinda Torres and 3 other Spanish-speaking women of the area who had been quietly grateful for her arrival. She had also made an unlikely but genuine friendship with Otto from the Silver Spur, whose German and whose memories of his own immigration gave them enough common ground for considerable conversation. Cole watched Marisol with the baby in those early weeks with the same attentive care he had brought to everything where she was concerned. And sometimes, in the evenings when the children were asleep and Catalina had retired, and the house was quiet except for the creek and the night sounds of Texas, he would find her in their room and stand behind her while she looked out the window and put his arms around her. And they would stand like that in the comfortable silence of people who have said all the important things and can therefore rest in the spaces between words. In one of those evenings, just past Elena's first month, she turned in his arms to look at him. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "That first day," she said, "in the Silver Spur, I heard what those women said, all of it, and I was standing there deciding whether I was going to cry or whether I was going to be my mother's daughter, and then I looked across the room and you were there." She paused. "You weren't pretending not to see me. You were just looking the way you look at things when you want to understand them, and I thought, that man looks at me like I make sense." Cole looked at her in the lamplight of their room, with the creek sound and the warm quiet of the house around them. "You make sense," he said. "More sense than most things I've encountered." She pressed her forehead against his. "That is perhaps the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." "I have more if you want them," he offered. "Later," she said, and kissed him, and the lamp burned on its little table, and the creek talked on over the limestone, and the Texas night settled in around the house on Pecan Creek like something familiar and entirely right. The years that followed were full ones. Marisol took on French and Spanish lessons for several of the town's children at a rate that was modest enough to be accessible and frequent enough to give her genuine occupation beyond the household, which she had known she would need. Cole expanded the horse operation in 1887, bringing in a partner, a steady man named Garrett who had a talent with horses and an honest handshake, and the Whitfield Garrett horses became known for quality throughout the region. Mateo grew into a serious, curious boy who followed his father around the ranch with a focus that was flattering and sometimes exhausting. Alina grew into a child of startling energy and purpose, talking in full sentences by the time she was 2, asking questions that required full answers, filling every room she was in with an animation that seemed to exceed her small size. In 1888, they planted a second pomegranate tree beside the first, which by then had grown into a proper, if still young, tree, and had produced its first real fruit. 3 pomegranates that Catalina treated as a personal triumph, and Marisol ate at the kitchen table with her eyes closed, tasting something that was the courtyard in Guadalajara and the smell of her mother's kitchen, and the particular color of the light in Jalisco on winter mornings. All together in the sweetness and the sting of the seeds, Cole watched her and asked no questions, understanding that this was a private experience he was privileged to witness. "Good?" he asked finally. "Yes," she said. She opened her eyes. "Come and taste." He did, sitting across from her at the kitchen table in the morning light of their Texas house, and she watched him taste something from her world and see him receive it without comparison or qualification, simply as its own thing, and she felt the particular deep contentment of being fully known. The Silver Spur Saloon underwent a change of management in 1889 when Otto retired to live with his daughter in San Antonio. The new keeper was a younger man who was less attentive to the clientele's needs, and the establishment gradually became something less distinguished. The fiddle player Mr. Marsh continued to play there on weekends, but supplemented his income by playing at private engagements and dances, which was how he came to play at the Whitfield Ranch for several of the social occasions that Marisol had begun hosting, informal dinners that drew a mix of people from the town, and the surrounding ranches that would have surprised the 1882 version of herself considerably. Mrs. Finch attended 2 of these gatherings and said nothing unpleasant at either of them. Whether this represented a genuine change of heart or simply the pragmatic recognition that social landscape had shifted was a question Marisol found she no longer particularly needed to resolve. What Mrs. Finch did or did not feel in her private mind was her own business. What mattered was what people did. Lucinda Torres and her husband were regulars at these gatherings, as was Agnes Park and her husband the doctor, as were various ranch families from the area whose relationship to the landscape was longer than most people in town acknowledged. On one occasion, Marisol invited to dinner a family whose name she had heard mentioned by Catalina, the Salazar family, who turned out not to be the original Salazars of Cole's father's day, but their cousins, who had returned to the area in the mid-'80s and were farming a small piece of land east of town. Cole sat across from the eldest Salazar brother and talked with him all evening, and afterward, helping Marisol clear the table, said quietly, "I think my father would have been glad of that." "I think so too," Marisol said. Henry Delaney, Sarah's boy, was by 1890 a young man of 12 who could ride and rope, and had his aunt's gift for languages, which Marisol was cultivating with the same patient attention she gave to all her students. Sarah and James had a 3rd child, a girl they named Rose, and the ranch on Pecan Creek became the kind of place that filled up on Sundays and holidays without anyone particularly planning it that way. It was on a Sunday in the autumn of 1890 that Cole and Marisol rode out alone together for the first time in what felt like a long while, because the children were with Catalina and Sarah, had the Sunday occupation well in hand. And it was one of those October days in Texas that are a distilled version of everything good about October. The air clear, and the light gold, and the creek running sweet and cold over the limestone. They rode to the bend where the herons had their nest, which had been repaired and rebuilt each spring now for 8 years, and was an impressive piece of ongoing construction. The herons were still there, or their successors were, because herons returned to good places. They tied the horses and sat on the limestone shelf above the creek, and Marisol leaned against Cole's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the water and the herons and the cottonwoods going gold against the blue sky. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. He asked her this sometimes, not because he couldn't guess, but because he liked to hear. "I'm thinking about the pomegranate tree," she said. "The first one. When we planted it, I thought it might grow if we were patient and lucky. Now it's 8 years old and taller than I am, and it gave us 37 pomegranates this year." 37, he confirmed. "I counted. I know you counted." She tilted her head to look up at him. "Cole, yes, I am so glad you crossed that room," she said. "In the Silver Spur that first day, I was standing there trying to decide what to do next, and you just walked across the room and asked if you could help. You looked like someone who knew what she was doing but could use a useful conversation," he said. "I was right." "You were," she agreed, "though I would not have admitted it then." He pressed his lips to her hair. They sat in the October afternoon while the creek ran and the herons stood in the shallows with their particular patient dignity, and the cottonwoods threw their gold into the blue air. "Is there anything missing?" he asked. He asked her this too, sometimes. Not anxiously, but with genuine open curiosity, the question of a person who intends to be honest about the answer. She thought about it as she always did, actually thought about it rather than reflexively reassuring him. Her mother was gone, and the courtyard in Guadalajara was in another person's hands now, and there were things she had lost that could not be recovered. She was a Mexican woman in a Texas town in 1890, and the injustices of that position were structural and old, and would not be resolved by love alone, however real and large the love was. There were days when the weight of it pressed on her in ways she did not always tell him about, though he usually knew. But there was Catalina in the kitchen singing, and Mateo learning to ride with his father's patient instruction, and Alina filling every room with her particular fierce light, and the pomegranate trees in the kitchen garden, and the creek, and this man whose arm was around her and who had looked at her from across a saloon room like she made sense. "No," she said, "nothing important." He held her closer. The herons did not move. The creek ran on. The light came down gold through the cottonwoods and lay on the water like something put there intentionally, like something meant. In the spring of 1891, Marisol wrote a letter to the school in Guadalajara, where the Sisters of Charity still taught, describing the life she had built in Texas and the need she had seen for better education for the Spanish-speaking children of the Dustcreek area, many of whom were caught between languages in a school system that acknowledged only one of them. She asked whether they knew of any teachers who might be interested in corresponding, in sharing methods, in thinking about how this problem might be approached with more intention. The reply she received 4 months later led, over the following 2 years, to a program of support and resource sharing that was small by any measure but real, and which served a handful of families in the area who had previously had no such support. Cole helped her write the proposal letters. He had the practical, organized mind of a man who knows how things need to be arranged to work, and his assistance was the kind that amplifies rather than replaces, the best kind. He was proud of her in a way that was genuine and unperformative, the pride of someone who loves a person's actual self and is therefore glad to see that self accomplish things. Told her so once, not as a speech but as a simple statement while they were working on one of the letters together at the kitchen table. "I'm proud of you," he said. She looked up. "For writing letters, for knowing what needs to be done and doing it," he said. "You've been doing it since the day I met you, in the Silver Spur with those women whispering and you standing there with your chin up like you owned the place." She laughed. "I was terrified." "I know," he said. "That's what made it something worth seeing." Mateo was 7 in 1891 and had his father's steadiness and his mother's curiosity, and he was learning Spanish alongside his English with the natural ease of a child raised in a bilingual household, which Marisol had been careful to maintain as a conscious choice, the way she was careful about many things that mattered and easy about things that did not. Alina was 5 and had passed through the phase of asking questions at a rate that exceeded anyone's ability to answer them, and emerged on the other side as a child who had decided she would find out the answers herself, which was both promising and occasionally alarming. Catalina had by this time become a genuine institution in Dustcreek, which would have surprised the stagecoach driver who had been so inconvenienced by her birds. She was known for her cooking, her opinions, and her extraordinary capacity for friendship across the various divides that a frontier town accumulated. She was also known, among the women who knew her well, for a particular gift for frank assessment that made her advice worth seeking if not always comfortable to receive. She told Marisol one morning, in the kitchen garden, where they often talked because Catalina had come to share Marisol's love of the garden with the enthusiasm of a convert, that she was glad she had come. "I was frightened," she said, which surprised Marisol because Catalina was not a woman who appeared to be frightened of many things. "After your mother died, I was frightened of being the last one, and then your letter came and you said come, and the fact that you said it," she stopped, pressing her lips together. "She would have said that was you being Esperanza's daughter." "Was I?" Marisol asked. Catalina looked at her with those warm, keen eyes. "You were, you are," she paused. She would have loved all of this. Him most of all, but all of it. "I know," Marisol said. They planted garlic that morning, which is work that asks for patience because it yields results in a future that is not yet visible, and it was the right work for the conversation. In 1893, the pomegranate tree, the first one, the one they had planted together in the spring of their first year on Pecan Creek, bloomed in a way it never had before, thick with red flowers that Mateo counted and Alina drew in the back pages of her composition book with the careful pleasure of a child who has decided that some things deserve to be recorded. Cole found Marisol standing in front of it one morning, early, before the household was fully awake, in the particular quality of morning light that is specific to Texas in late spring, warm and clear and full of birdsong. She was holding her coffee cup in both hands and looking at the tree. He came to stand beside her without saying anything. The tree was taller than her now by a good foot, its branches spreading with the settled confidence of something that has decided it belongs where it is. The flowers were extraordinary, each one a small red lantern, the color of certainty. She felt his hand find hers. 11 years, she said. "I planted it 11 years ago, and I was not certain it would survive the first winter." "You gave it everything it needed," he said. She looked at the tree and then at him, and he was looking at her with the same expression she had first seen across a crowded saloon room in 1882, when she had not yet known who he was or what that expression meant. But something in her had recognized it anyway as the beginning of something she could not have predicted and would not trade for anything in the world. "We did," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, unhurried, in the private morning of their own yard with no audience but the birds and the tree. And she thought of her mother's courtyard and the fountain that sounded like a long conversation and the pomegranate that had grown there. And then she thought of this, of here, of now, and found that both things could be true and both could be beautiful, and neither canceled the other. From inside the house came the sound of Alina awake and beginning her morning declarations, and Mateo's lower voice responding with the patient tolerance of a 9-year-old brother who has had time to develop strategies, and Catalina's voice rising above both of them with the particular note she used when she wanted breakfast to proceed in an organized manner. Cole looked toward the house with the fond, slightly braced expression of a man who loves his household and knows what it requires of him. "Ready," Marisol said. "Always," he said. They went in together, hand in hand through the morning, into the noise and warmth and beautiful ordinary business of their life. And the pomegranate tree stood in the kitchen garden of the ranch on Pecan Creek and bloomed and bloomed and bloomed.